Mr. Chairman, we thank the speakers for their contributions to the discussion. Civilians around the world continue to bear the brunt of armed conflict. In 2024, the UN recorded 36,000 civilian deaths in 14 armed conflicts around the world. Notably, we are not given a breakdown by country. However, from open-source analysis, it appears that about half of these individuals died in Gaza and the West Bank, where bloody conflict continues. Last year, at a similar event, we discussed the famine in Gaza. This year, according to the Secretary-General's report, 86% of the population in the Strip is in a situation of acute food shortage or artificial famine, from which they too are dying. 19 out of 36 hospitals have been destroyed. Children have already missed 2 years of school. Attacks on humanitarian workers continue. The question arises, why has there been no progress in protecting civilians in Gaza throughout the conflict? The answer is obvious. The ongoing fighting has not improved the situation of the civilian population, including women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. Mr. Chairman, the conclusion in the Secretary-General's report that the assessment of the legality or illegality of a particular action from the point of view of international humanitarian law in the modern world largely depends on political preferences is very relevant. Indeed, we see this regularly in the Council's deliberations. However, it is absolutely unacceptable when such political preferences become the basis for the preparation of reports by our organisation. Thus, the Secretary-General's report prepared for our meeting, in the part concerning Ukraine, mentions the civilian population of Russia affected by the conflict only once, in the context of displaced persons. At the same time, it is not explained that this concerns the use of hundreds of civilians abducted by the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kursk region as hostages. The question arises, in the opinion of the Secretariat, there are no civilians killed or wounded in Russia? No attacks on civilian objects and civilian infrastructure? Why is this information not included in the Secretary-General's report at all? Last year, during a similar presentation, we provided all the necessary statistics for the previous year. We regularly provide the UN with such information in writing. If you don't believe us, study open sources, and you will find out that over the past 2024, according to the most minimal estimates, the number of civilian casualties in Russia is approaching 5.5 thousand people, of whom more than 800 people died. About 300 miners were injured and maimed, 51 children died. The main cause of civilian casualties was shelling of civilian infrastructure facilities with explosive weapons, small arms and light weapons, mainly of foreign manufacture. Study the issue of how Ukrainian drone operators hunt civilian vehicles in frontline areas. The report mentions an appeal to the states of the International Court of Justice not to supply weapons to parties to an armed conflict that violate international humanitarian law. However, nothing is said about the ongoing supply of weapons to the Kyiv regime. However, the report mentions 300 attacks on energy infrastructure facilities in Ukraine that allegedly took place. It doesn't mention that these are infrastructure facilities serving military facilities, and the figures are taken on faith directly from the Ukrainian side. The report even stoops to the unacceptable dissemination of Western fakes about the separation of children from their parents and forced removal without any specifics or supporting information. Mr. Chairman, another important item on the agenda discussed today is the issue of journalists' safety in armed conflicts. Kyiv has unleashed a real terror against Russian media representatives who perform their professional duty, covering what is happening in the SVO zone. The number of dead and wounded since February 2022 has reached dozens. Since the beginning of this year alone, as a result of targeted attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces, including the use of high-precision missiles, 5 Russian media workers have been killed, and numerous employees have been injured to varying degrees of severity. And again, despite our regular appeals, all these crimes do not receive the slightest condemnation from the UN. The embodiment of such a cynical approach was the biennial report of the Director General of UNESCO on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity for 2022 to 2023, which ignored numerous facts of the death of Russian correspondents at the hands of the armed forces of Ukraine. The report of the Secretary General, in turn, refers to UNESCO data on the death of journalists. Thus, there is no objective information here either. The report notes the desire to combat impunity in Ukraine. I wonder what is the basis for such a conclusion regarding a country that even ratified the Rome Statute of the ICC with a reservation excluding the responsibility of its soldiers for war crimes. We believe that the description of the situation in Ukraine in the report is worthy of an internal investigation. How can one talk about concern for the protection of civilians after such outright lies and distortions? Here, we must first sort things out with the Secretariat itself and punish the authors for attempting to mislead the Security Council. Mr. Chairman, the responsibility to ensure accountability for violations of international humanitarian law lies with every state. National justice efforts form the basis of the fight against impunity. We cannot understand the reason for the persistence with which the report year after year includes information on the activities of the International Criminal Court. This is a separate structure from the UN and has no relation to the World Organization. The ICC is mired in politicization and double standards and has become famous for its inefficiency. The call addressed to states in the report to accede to the statute of this puppet tribunal is extremely inappropriate. The only thing that can argue with the inefficiency of the ICC is the residual mechanism for international criminal tribunals, which is complementarily mentioned in the report. This structure and its predecessor, the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, cost the UN billions of dollars and became bywords for double standards and selective justice. It is difficult to understand the enthusiasm in the document about the trials conducted on the basis of the concept of universal jurisdiction in a number of Western countries. I would like to remind you that Western states have long been actively abusing the concept of universal jurisdiction to interfere in the internal affairs of developing countries, including ignoring the norms of international customary law. The illegality of such actions was confirmed by the International Court of Justice, and African countries, dissatisfied with the abuse of universal jurisdiction, initiated a specialized discussion in the 6th Committee of the General Assembly, which reflects a significant difference of opinion on this issue. Mr. Chairman, we would like to dwell separately on the issue of protecting civilians as part of peacekeeping mandates. The protection of civilians is a temporary measure necessary to give time to find a political and diplomatic solution to the conflict. It is also important to understand that this is the area of responsibility of national governments and their security agencies. When peacekeeping missions have a mandate to protect civilians, it must be implemented in a comprehensive manner and in close cooperation with national authorities, local communities, and relevant humanitarian organizations. However, the main role in protecting civilians is played by military and police contingents of UN peacekeeping operations, which provide direct protection to the most vulnerable segments of the population in the conflict, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. In this regard, efforts to promote security sector reform and improve the training of security institutions must go hand in hand, since without strengthening and professionalizing them, sustainable results cannot be achieved. This area is not always given sufficient attention. The issue of the realism of peacekeeping mission mandates for the protection of civilians, which include human rights monitoring, including gender issues, and the prevention of sexual violence, etc., requires additional consideration. This leads to an unjustified interrelationship between political, human rights, and humanitarian activities. To what extent this increases overall effectiveness is a big question, but it definitely contributes to the growth of expectations of the population, which are not always met. In addition, in a number of cases, human rights monitoring is used to exert political pressure on the relevant government, which is generally unacceptable. We also do not see how special political missions, as well as UN humanitarian workers, can actually contribute to the protection of civilians under threat of violence. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, we would like to draw attention to another conclusion of the Secretary-General's report that the situation with the protection of civilians continues to deteriorate 150 years after the creation of the relevant norms. We cannot agree with this statement. Despite the difficult situation of civilians in armed conflicts today, it cannot be compared to what happened more than 80 years ago during the Second World War on the territory of the USSR. Then, during the 3 years of occupation of Soviet territory by the German Nazis, more than 13 million civilians were killed. At the same time, despite the verdict of the Nuremberg Tribunal, a significant part of the most odious Nazis remained free. Western countries, which are so keen to fight impunity today, looked at this situation quite calmly, sheltered them, and allowed numerous Nazi criminals to escape punishment. Thank you for your attention.